When it comes to seminal franchises being abused and misused by a clueless publisher, there are few game series that can compare to Metal Gear. Starting life back in 1987 on the NES, the now infamous series would explode in popularity with the release of 1998's Metal Gear Solid on the PlayStation 1. In the years that followed, Metal Gear Solid would both spawn a bunch of sequels and elevate series creator Hideo Kojima from game director to revered auteur. But while there's plenty to talk about from the mainline series, Metal Gear has also seen its fair share of spin-offs, from the weird and interesting to the downright awful. So I thought, wouldn't it be fun to talk about them and rank them all from worst to best, at least in my opinion. And so, with a spring in my step and tactical espionage action in my heart, I've spent the last 5 days or so playing through every Metal Gear spin-off I could get my hands on.
How long? How many hours? How many days? 5. Shit!
But before we start, it's worth noting a few things. Firstly, I won't be talking about any of the rubbish mobile games or the Japan-only releases, as I've never played any of them, and I have no way of doing so. Also, I'll be leaving out Portable Ops Plus and Twin Snakes, mainly because the former is basically an online-only experience that now has no servers, and the latter is less of a spin-off and more of a full remake. So with all that said, let's get to it, shall we? Coming as no surprise to anyone, we're starting at the bottom of the list with 2018's Metal Gear Survive, a game that few people played and absolutely no one liked. Taking place at some point between Ground Zeroes and Metal Gear 5, Survive seems to assert that after Snake and his pals left their base, they failed to notice a massive wormhole opening in the sky above it. A wormhole that, once your created character enters, leads to a place that's even worse than hell. That's right, it's a live service game. Releasing as the first game to carry the Metal Gear moniker after the messy and somewhat nasty breakup between Konami and Kojima, Metal Gear Survive is kinda like all the worst things about Konami in recent years, distilled into one cynical product. Gameplay is a mix of third-person combat, shooting, crafting, and base building, with most of your time being spent gathering ingredients and very slowly killing idiotic enemies in the dullest way possible. I mean, the game does look and feel pretty good moment to moment, I guess, and some of the assets are also quite nice, but that's all because it simply reuses everything wholesale from Metal Gear Solid 5, a game that took years to make and pushed the Fox engine to new levels of excellence. In a nutshell, nothing about Metal Gear Survive is good, except the stuff that was done better or copied from Metal Gear 5, and that's just a fact. But more than all of this, the game just isn't well paced or fun to play. It drags on and on for hours after it feels like it should have ended. And also, it just seems to have removed all of the weird and interesting narrative elements that the series is known for. It didn't help that, at the time it came out, its attempts to bandwagon on a popular but very oversaturated genre, the zombie survival live service game, seemed so at odds with the IP that it was met with a collective "what the fuck?" from fans. More than that though, this just doesn't feel like a Metal Gear game. And despite using many of the same assets, maps, and character models as Metal Gear 5, the whole thing just feels like a piss-poor attempt to trick long-term fans into committing to another stupid live service. Oh yeah, and did I mention that while this game can be played either alone or with others, it requires a constant internet connection regardless, meaning that when the servers are turned off, which I'm guessing they will be at some point relatively soon, Metal Gear Survive will be little more than a glorified coaster. Still, given how boring and tedious this game is to play, that might actually be for the best. Next up is a game that proves Konami have always had it in them to produce a cash grab, and that's 1990's Snake's Revenge. Developed without Kojima's input, knowledge, or consent, this game was a quickie sequel made to appeal to the Western market, and as such is not and was never considered mainline or canon. Set 3 years after the very first game, Snake's Revenge tells the story of Lieutenant Solid Snake, yeah, that's literally what he's called in this game, like it's his actual fucking name or something, being sent to the Middle East along with 2 buddies to thwart a new plot by a hostile nation who seem to have gotten hold of plans for a new Metal Gear. What follows is a relatively generic and somewhat rushed sequel that somehow feels like it's lacking the soul of the franchise already. Gameplay-wise, it plays a lot like the NES original, albeit with a lot of the flair and interesting ideas stripped out. While reports on this have been mixed, it has been said several times that playing this game is what convinced Kojima to make his own sequel, the far superior Metal Gear 2 Solid Snake. And so at least that's one good thing to come out of Snake's Revenge, I guess. Kojima has also been quoted as saying that he thought the game was, quote, somewhat of a crappy game, end quote. Although this was apparently done in jest, and he would roll this back in a later interview with Nintendo Power, instead calling the game, quote, faithful to the Metal Gear concept, end quote, and, quote, not a bad game, end quote. Either way though, I think you can read between the lines here. If you're thinking of playing through every game in this franchise, my advice would be to save yourself a few hours and give this one a miss. Now that we've got those two out the way, we can start to wash the taste of shit out of our mouths, as luckily, things actually start to improve exponentially from here, starting with 2006's Metal Gear Portable Ops. Released exclusively on the PSP, Portable Ops was set 6 years after the events of Metal Gear Solid 3 Snake Eater, and continued the story of Naked Snake and his slow descent from loyal soldier to freedom fighter to full-on terrorist. Gameplay-wise, Portable Ops is pretty much your standard Metal Gear fare, albeit altered slightly due to its existence as a handheld-only title and its heavier focus on multiplayer. In between story segments, players will take on missions, recruit soldiers, and at least back in the day, could play alongside friends and randoms to progress. This was even the impetus for the aforementioned standalone expansion Portable Ops Plus, which basically removed all of the single-player content and doubled down on the multiplayer aspect. But despite it not being a bad game, when it comes down to it, Portable Ops' mission-based structure that's mainly focused around Snake recruiting soldiers for his new army is a narrative framing that they always seem to use for Big Boss post-Snake Eater, and unfortunately, it's done much better in other games, one of which we'll get to on this very list. While there's nothing really wrong with Portable Ops, it's kind of not required reading for this series, and adds little to the grand scheme of things. The story, while sharing some interesting narrative similarities to another game on this list that takes place in an alternate timeline, never really does much with its concepts, and unfortunately descends into little more than fan service by the end. Also, while it's perfectly serviceable to play, and even fun in places, its gameplay loop of recruitment-focused missions, coupled with its clearly online adjacent design that's now no longer active, means that the whole thing's just okay, even by the standards seen outside the mainline series. Unless you happen to have a working PSP and a copy of the game, the only other way to access this game nowadays is via emulation, and with a dead multiplayer element, it's probably not worth your time unless you really want to experience every single game in the series. So this next game on the list really only finds itself this low because of all the games we're going to talk about in this video, it's the one that feels most like a standalone expansion, and that's Metal Gear Solid VR Missions. Released in 1999 on the PlayStation, just a year after the original Metal Gear Solid, VR Missions is basically an expansion of a feature that appeared in the original game, which also added new gameplay elements and even allowed you to play as other characters besides Snake. Now don't get me wrong, I, like most of those who played the original Metal Gear Solid, loved the VR missions, and I have nothing against this game generally speaking. But given the series' heavy focus on narrative, weird characters and borderline ridiculous plot revelations, VR Missions kind of feels more like a large DLC mission pack than a full game release. Sure, the bite-sized nature of each mission makes for a great gameplay loop, and it says a lot about the design and execution of the original game that what is essentially a collection of narrative-light, simulated combat puzzles still hold up as well as they do today. But I just think that putting it any higher on this list wouldn't really be fair, as in the pantheon of Metal Gear spin-offs, it's more of a great snack than a hearty meal. Either way though, it's still a great time, and now it's been included in the latest release of Metal Gear Solid for modern platforms, there's no excuse not to give it a try. Next up is a bit more of a lesser known title, and one that I hadn't played through until recently, and that's Metal Gear Solid Ghost Babel, or just Metal Gear Solid on the Game Boy Color outside of Japan. Set in an alternate non-canon timeline after the very first Metal Gear game on the NES, Ghost Babel tells a completely unique story that is free from the canon in every way. Taking place 7 years after the Outer Heaven uprising seen in the first game, a new Metal Gear prototype has been stolen by a guerrilla group in the fictional African nation of Gindra, and it's up to the now retired Snake to come back and stop the threat while also figure out who's behind it and why. Gameplay-wise, it sort of sits more in line with the original games in the series, and feels kind of more like a spiritual successor to them than anything else. It has a bird's-eye camera view, similar level layouts and objectives, and the combat and boss fights are also extremely similar to both original titles. After a relatively soft release back in 2000, Ghost Babel has always been a bit of a cult hit with fans, with many outside of Japan not even realising it was its own story, due to it being titled and marketed as simply Metal Gear Solid in other regions, which meant that a lot of people thought it was just the Game Boy version of the PS1 classic, you know, like they used to do all the time back in the day. Since then though, I feel like it's only grown in popularity, with many still singing its praises and hoping it will make its way onto one of the master collections that Konami seem to be peddling now. Although I wouldn't hold your breath. Either way though, Ghost Babel is definitely an interesting and fun game that any Metal Gear fan should check out. Its story has all the weird hallmarks of the series, coupled with plenty of references and homages to other IP, and its writing is strong enough to hold up even today, especially for a Game Boy Color title. Also, it's worth noting that this game was the first title in the franchise since Metal Gear Solid had really put it on the map, and only the second game in the franchise overall, including spin-offs, that was not directed by series creator Hideo Kojima. While Kojima would still have a producer credit, directing duties on Ghost Babel would instead be handled by Shinta Nojiri, a man who would make his mark on the franchise a few more times before seemingly vanishing into thin air about a decade ago. But more on that in a little bit. The next game on the list is one I struggled as to whether I should even include, mainly because it's actually more of a playable prologue than a full game, and that's Metal Gear Solid 5 Ground Zeroes. Released at the end of 2014, it acted both as a demonstration of what we could expect from the next full entry in the mainline series, as well as a narrative setup for the story it would tell. And if I'm honest, while it was sold separately and is an awesome time for the few hours it lasts, the fact that it's more of a prelude than a full entry is why it's lower down on this list. Set a few months after the end of another game that we'll talk about shortly, the game follows Snake as he attempts to infiltrate a base in Cuba called Camp Omega and liberate some of the people who have been captured and taken there. Gameplay-wise, it's set up quite a lot like Metal Gear 5 would be, with a mission-based structure, various objectives, and a ranking system, all of which feed into a greater set of completion criteria. While the game is brief, only running a few hours if you just want the story, there are a lot of people, myself included, who ended up putting an awful lot of hours into this thing, mainly because it showed us a new, mechanics-heavy Metal Gear that, while not devoid of the usual indulgence seen in its narrative, was definitely much less cutscene and story heavy than the series had been in recent years. On top of this though, it was just really fun to play, with responsive controls, great presentation and solid design. While everything it does was arguably improved upon or developed further in Metal Gear Solid 5, I know there are some out there that even say this is the better game, and while I'm not sure I would go that far myself, it's definitely worth playing nonetheless. Announced back in 2009, Metal Gear Solid Rising Revengeance, then just called Metal Gear Solid Rising, was originally in development at Kojima Productions. However, when Kojima and his team ran into difficulties trying to realise the idea, the game was abruptly cancelled, before then miraculously being resurrected, retitled and handed off to Platinum Games, a company known for its third-person action chops. Set 4 years after the events of Metal Gear Solid 4, it tells the story of what happened to the world after that game, and also what Raiden got up to afterwards. And let me tell you, while some of the shit he did in Metal Gear Solid 4 was crazy, Revengeance just takes things to a whole nother level. And the only word I can use to describe some of this shit is bonkers. Utilising a great parry system, a still unrivaled cutting mechanic, and one of the best final boss fights in video game history, Metal Gear Rising Revengeance was an absolute joy to play. While I will concede that the tonal shift is a little much in places, and the control system feels a bit odd at first, once you adapt, you'll realise that there's nothing quite like it, and there are few things as satisfying as chopping up an enemy into tiny pieces. The only things that I think really hold this game back are its camera, which can be a fucking pain in the ass sometimes, especially when trying to directional parry, and the environments, which can look a bit bland and lifeless at times. Still, none of this is enough to ruin the game, and if you have a spare 6 to 10 hours, then there are a few better ways to spend your time than playing through Metal Gear Rising Revengeance. So now we move into the top 3, and first up is Metal Gear Acid 2 for the PSP. Once again taking place in an alternate non-canon timeline, Acid 2 begins with an amnesiac Snake re-entering the United States illegally with a couple of new buddies after having liberated a dictatorship overseas. However, it's not long after landing that the still memory-devoid Snake and his new comrades are arrested, and our stoic hero is once again tasked with taking to the field in order to ensure their release, stop another Metal Gear, and uncover his lost memories in the process. While I don't want to go into too much detail here, because despite the game's age, I think it's worth going in blind, what I will say is the story told in Metal Gear Acid 2 is equal parts awesome and ridiculous. While it is debatable whether it's better overall than Metal Gear Acid 1, its narrative pacing is certainly better, and it also goes to arguably wilder places. Also, another thing that is better than the first Acid is the moment-to-moment gameplay, which has been refined and expanded in almost every way. For those who've never played them before, the Acid games are not your typical Metal Gear Solid fare when it comes to gameplay, and instead use a, and I know it sounds weird, turn-based, card-based system. Wait, I know, but trust me, while this sounds fucking weird, it actually works really well, and also still manages to capture a lot of what makes the series great. Every action, attack, and movement is handled by cards, but objectives and level structure is basically the same as any other mainline game in the series. Think Metal Gear Solid 2 meets XCOM meets, I don't know, Phantasy Star Online Episode 3? As the second Acid game, and the third Metal Gear game directed by Shinta Nojiri, it's clear that a huge effort was made by the director and his team to try and improve on what came before. And in a practical sense, they were successful. There are more cards, more diverse missions, a fun new art style, a better paced narrative, and even a weird 3D accessory that literally no one cared about, remembers, or ever used. But despite all of its qualities, I do have a few issues with some of the creative choices here and there, and I also just generally feel less nostalgia for this game than the first, a fact which I know shouldn't affect its placement on the list, but it does anyway, and that's why it's number 3 and not number 2 or number 1. Even so though, as a newcomer who hasn't played any of these spin-offs before, I think that many, if not most, would think Metal Gear Acid 2 was the best Acid game, and also the best of Nojiri's directed games, and to be honest, I can't fault anyone for thinking that. But this isn't your list, it's mine, bitch! That's right, through a mixture of nostalgia, originality, and a genuine love for the story it tells, Metal Gear Acid 1 just edges out its sequel for me, and takes the number 2 spot on this list. While it's clear that a lot of improvements were made to the general gameplay and design in the second game, the fact that this original game laid the foundations and did so while also doing something completely new with the franchise just makes it even more awesome to me. Taking place as the other Nojiri-directed games do, in an alternate non-canon timeline, albeit one that occurs before Acid 2, the game follows Snake as he tries to find the truth behind Pythagoras, a covert research project being conducted inside the United States. It seems a terrorist organisation has hijacked an airliner and planted a bomb on board, threatening to blow it up if Pythagoras isn't turned over to them in a timely manner. What's more, one of the passengers on board is a US senator and presidential candidate, only making everything more dangerous and higher stakes for Snake and the comrades he meets along the way. What follows is a plot filled with twists and turns that, while occasionally uneven, still feels uniquely Metal Gear in its execution. I've read several times throughout my research that Nojiri was actually being lined up as the heir apparent for the whole franchise, with the idea that he would take the keys to the kingdom off Kojima, who had already intermittently threatened to move on from Metal Gear back in the early 2000s. While this was never confirmed, and also clearly never happened, what is clear, even from the 3 games he did direct, is that he understood what makes Metal Gear, at least better than Konami has in a long time, and few games show just how true this is, more than Metal Gear Acid 1. Gameplay is again turn-based, just like it would be in Acid 2, with visual novel-style sections in between to tell the story. Also, the art style here is more akin to the PS2 era Metal Gear games, and while the second game definitely has more of a visual identity, this look is just one of my own personal favourites. Also, speaking of the sequel, maybe it's just me, but I feel like there are some elements in Metal Gear Acid 2 that are a little bit more juvenile and cringy. I'm looking at you, Divining Rod section. And while the first game is not completely free of this stuff, it rears its head far less often for sure. Either way though, whichever Metal Gear Acid game you play, you're in for at least 15 to 20 hours of awesome gameplay, gripping story, and unique execution that I haven't really seen in any other game before or since. I know these games are not often remembered, and I'm not sure how many people loved the Acid games as much as I did, but if Konami ever get their shit together, and Shinta Nojiri is ever found in the bowels of whatever fucking health club or pachinko parlour they have him working in, then I'd absolutely love to see a Metal Gear Acid 3 someday. And so here we are now, at the end of all things, or at least the end of this list, with the final entry and best Metal Gear spin-off, in my opinion, and it probably won't come as much of a surprise to anyone who's played it. That's right, taking the top spot and standing as one of my favourite games in the series is Metal Gear Solid Peace Walker. Taking place 4 or so years after Portable Ops, the game follows Big Boss as he begins recruiting for what will eventually become Outer Heaven, tying the game back to the original NES title perfectly. While Metal Gear Solid 5 would retcon and iterate on some of this stuff, at the time, it felt like a nice cyclical arc for Big Boss's character, especially if you'd been playing since the early days of the franchise. Now, while Peace Walker is steeped a little deeply in Metal Gear lore, its presence as a mainline entry does at least mean that its story is important and relevant to the series' ongoing narrative. I mean, bear in mind that at one point, this game was actually titled Metal Gear Solid 5, and I think there are a few more poignant examples of how important this game was considered at the time. Releasing on the PSP in 2010, Peace Walker would be one of the later games in that seminal handheld's life cycle, and this means it was able to fully stretch the hardware to its limits. Unlike the turn-based gameplay of the Acid series, or the stripped-down gameplay of Portable Ops, Peace Walker was instead a much more open, fully fledged Metal Gear experience, with larger areas to explore and more dynamic combat encounters. While it's true that the game was mission-based, a fact that actually helped it fit better on a handheld, its structure and gameplay loop was so refined, and its game feel was so good, that it's still a joy to play today, even through the modern HD collection or through emulation. It also just looked and sounded great too, and a lot of what was in this game would be the blueprint for Metal Gear Solid 5. I mean, the soldier recruitment, the base management, and the mission-based structure were all here, man, years before Metal Gear 5's development had even begun. Of course, because Konami, this game was omitted from the recent Master Collection, and was even missing from the Vita version of the HD Collection, so you'd have to buy it separately for far more money from the PlayStation Store as a PSP game. Stay classy, Konami. But hopefully it will appear on later collections, along with some of the other games on this list, because otherwise I feel like a lot of Metal Gear fans might never get to play Peace Walker, and that would be nothing less than a travesty. But anyway, that's it for my list. So let me know if you agree or how you'd rank these games in the comments below. And also, maybe give a like and a sub if you want to help support the channel. After all, without all of you, I'm just a man sitting alone in the dark, talking to no one. Oh God!
Hey kid, don't ever let them get inside your head. They'll tell you what to do in life instead of everything you know that you could get. Don't let them guide your life towards regret. I'll fight for what I love with every breath. My past is filled with things I won't forget. I use them all to push me to my best. So treat the worst of times just like a test.
I'm done. You, fuck off out of here.
Me?
Get out. Hey, excuse me, madam.
Yes, sir.
Fuck me. How about fuck you?